we aren't just saved for ourselves. It's not just about me going to heaven. We're saved for a purpose. And so the answer to that question brings us to a discussion of our mission, which brings us back to Matthew 28, the Great Commission, and what we've been talking about on and over again for the last couple of years, discipleship. And so this is a critical part of the answer to this. And so what we acknowledge, or what we talked about last week, is a couple things. We acknowledge that our mission as disciples calls us not to sequester ourselves, not to hide behind walls. It calls us to go out into culture. It calls us to be among culture, not to retreat from culture. And it calls us to our present day culture. We have ideas about some idealized time in the past. Oh, if we could just go back there, man, we could really do some work there. Things would be so much better there. That doesn't happen. It can't happen. We are here today. This is our cultural moment. And so if we're going to accomplish God's mission, we have to accomplish it in our culture, in our present day. And so, sometimes we get the feeling, as we deal with culture, we get the feeling like this lighthouse. God calls us to be light. Jesus says, go out and be the light of the world. And we try to do that in our culture, but very often we feel like the waves of culture are beating on us, hammering against us, knocking us down, shaking our foundation. And so that's a hard thing to deal with. And yet, actually, we're not called to be lighthouses so much as we're called to be chocolate chip cookies. And that was that analogy I told you last week. I wish I had come up with it, but it works. We are called, culture is the batter. Culture is the cookie. We, as Christians, are to live in culture as the chocolate chips. We mix in with the batter. The batter is all integrated, but we're in the batter, but we're distinct. We're identifiable. And I think that image is going to be one we're going to want to carry with us in this study, the idea of being the chips in the cookie. All right, I want to take sort of a half step back this morning, and I want to spend some time really talking more about culture. The subject of this series is Christianity and culture. If you're here this morning, chances are you've got a pretty decent handle on Christianity. If you don't, you're just checking us out, or you're checking out this church or Christianity in general. We would love to talk to you, and I want to encourage you to find somebody with a name tag today and say, hey, I'd like to know more about Christianity. We would like nothing more than to sit down with you and have that conversation. We got a lot of people who would love to do that. But most people are here today with some familiarity about Christianity. That's not the issue. Our struggle is we don't know about culture like we should. We don't understand sometimes what we're saying when we refer to culture, when we use that terminology. At some point in this series, we're going to move into a conversation about some issues in our culture. And there's going to be quite a few things we'll take a look at. We won't get to everything that you might be on your list of burning things we need to discuss in this subject. We're going to do that. That may be more exciting than some of what we're going to talk about today, but this is foundational. And I think it's critical if we're going to go out into the world and we're going to be those chocolate chips in that cookie dough. That we need to understand what culture is and what it's about. It's important. So let's start here. There is apparently, I try not to fall for the old an ancient Chinese proverb says, but apparently, near as I can tell, there is an actual Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know what water is like, don't ask a fish. Now, that's not because fish can't talk, all right? You might think that. It's actually because the problem with the fish in water is that the fish doesn't know that he's in water. Water is that's just the world in which he lives. I mean, it's very much like oxygen is for us, right? When is the last time you stopped and thought about whatever this is that we're living in and breathing in? We think it's nothing, because we can't see it and we can't feel it, and we think it's different. We think water's different because when we get in water, it is different, but it's like when the fish leaves the water and gets in the air, right? And so culture's very much like this. If you want to know what water is, you don't ask the fish, because the fish is immersed in it. The fish is surrounded by it. To the fish, the water is normal. It's just the way things are. And so if we want a fish to understand what water is like, we got to get the fish outside the water. And this is how it is for us in culture. For humans, culture is the water that we live in. And not only is it what we live in, it's what we think is normal. It's just the way the world is. It's the way the world reacts. It's the way the world acts. We're surrounded by it. We're immersed in it. And in many ways, we are unaware of how culture affects us because of that, whether it affects us in a positive way or whether it affects us in a negative way. And so again, I think we need to spend some time today talking a little bit about what culture is and perhaps just a little bit about what culture is not, so that we can better understand how we're going to go out and live in culture as disciples of Jesus Christ on a mission. So maybe the biggest, if you want to talk about literal differences, maybe the biggest literal difference between culture and water is that human beings actually create culture. It's something that we make. And really that distinction is sort of at the root of how we might define culture. One author that I was reading put it this way, and I think this is as good a definition of anything. He said, culture is what human beings make of the world. And so our culture is expressed in what we do. On a lot of different levels, in a lot of different ways. And so our culture is expressed in what we build. Our culture is expressed in what we invent. It's expressed in what we create. It's expressed in what we destroy. It's expressed in what we emphasize. It's expressed in what we believe. It's expressed in what we ignore. It's expressed in what we worship. And on we could go. You see, unlike animals, humans do more with our world than just survive in it. You know, that is the main goal of an animal. An animal gets up in the morning and says, how do I live through this day, consciously or unconsciously? I got to find some food, and I got to avoid the people on the upside of the food chain, and that's the main goal of life. If I can get through today, then I'll get up and I'll do it all over again tomorrow. That's what animals do. That's not what humans do. Since the very beginning of time, humans have tried to shape our world. We've tried to make it into something. And so consciously or unconsciously, this is the process of creating culture. Culture is a reflection of something that we talk about once in a while, but we haven't talked about probably in a while, and that is worldview. A worldview is what we believe about how the world works. And this is important. This matters. It's not exciting, but it is how we live. It's how we live our lives. And so we have, in our worldview, we have ideas about what morality is and where it comes from. We have ideas about what reality is and where it comes from. Our worldview is where we go to think about what we believe about whether or not there is a God. And so these are just some of the things that make up our worldview. And so different cultures reflect different worldviews. And that's a very practical thing. That's why you see cultures vary a lot across time and across location. It's why we've had people go to Uganda, their culture is different. We've had people travel to Central America to do mission work. Their cultures are different. And so this is a very practical thing. The apologist Ravi Zacharias put it this way. He said, in some cultures, people love their neighbors. In other cultures, they eat them. Okay? That's a pretty basic way of describing how culture can be different across time and across location. And this is also why culture changes, why it shifts sometimes dramatically and sometimes very quickly. As worldviews change, culture changes. And we see this, I think, kind of at the core of a lot of the epic changes that we observe as we look out into our culture and as we try to make sense of it. For example, 100 years ago, this is a picture of Fred and Rosalie Kurtz with Aislinn last week. Aislinn got married last Saturday. By the way, Aaron Self got married yesterday. We've had a couple of scattered church weddings all over. 100 years ago, marriage was viewed a little differently in America than it is now. 100 years ago, marriage was viewed by virtually everyone in our culture as a lifelong commitment. I put Fred and Rose up there because they've been married, I think, 127 years or something like that. They have literally been married, I don't know, forever. I think they were childhood sweethearts. And so that's powerful. And so that was a part of, in our culture, that was a part of our worldview. It was a part of our ideas in America about how the world works. This is what happens. You get married because, everybody gets married. And when you get married, it's forever. And so that's just the way it works. That's the way that things happen. And so our culture at that time, because of our worldview, our culture 100 years ago, I wasn't really suggesting that they were around 100 years ago, but our culture 100 years ago placed a high value on marriage. And then came, among other things, what we call the sexual revolution. And it's not quite as neat and orderly as in 1965 this all changed, but in particular in the 60s, the sexual revolution, And so that idea about marriage began to shift. It began to change during the sexual revolution. The worldview about the permanence of marriage in particular began to shift. And so as a result, marriage became less valued in our culture. And so we see that today, 50 years later, reflected in a number of different ways. We see that today in a much higher rate of divorce, of course, than we saw 100 years ago. We see that today in a much higher percentage of people who decide to cohabitate before they get married, and sometimes to cohabitate and never get married. We see it in a much higher rate in our culture of children being born into families where the parents are not married. We see it more and more in a situation in which, especially with younger generations, waiting till a much older age to get married, if at all, because those values have changed. And things like that are common in culture. Culture is dynamic. Culture never stays still, which is one of the hardest things about it. Man, if we could just get a lasso around it and make it stop, we'd have time to figure it out. And about the time we get one thing figured out, it's shifted and changed, and we're dealing with something else. Now, as Christians, it's helpful to remember something. I think that this is important, and we forget this, and that is that culture was not some random discovery by mankind. Culture was actually designed and given to us by God. And you can go back to the very beginning to sort of get an idea about this. And if you'd rather look in your own Bibles, go back to Genesis 1 and the creation account. And one of the things that we read there, God says to man and to woman, he says, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. And that really is the notion of, this is more than just making babies. God just doesn't make man and woman and design them a certain way so that they can reproduce, even though that's a part of his plan. This is about how God says, go out and make something of the world. Go out and do something in the world. Don't just sit in the garden and make babies and eat. It's not what I made you for. I made you to accomplish something. And so from that point, now again, there were other factors involved, but from this point, human beings begin to grow and scatter and fill the earth. And what do? They build towns. And they design languages. And they start to create arts and architecture and things like that. They make tools and they start doing things with tools. They solve problems. They formulate laws. That's culture. That's culture. And it's how God made us. We were created. We were created in the image of God. I think that has a lot of implications, but one of those implications is we were created by somebody to go out and to be creators, to go out and create with what God has given to us. And so I think in a very real sense, we could say culture is not man's idea. Culture is God's idea. And that brings us, I think, to one more thing that is worth mentioning as we try to define it, and that is that culture is not all bad. When Christians talk about culture, a lot of times we make it sound like it's all bad, don't we? Because I think that's the stuff we talk about. We talk about the stuff that we feel is bad, the stuff that we feel goes against God's word. And so that's a problem because the term itself is neutral. Culture is not by definition good or bad. It's a lot like the word change. A lot of times if you say, we want to change something, people react to that, whoa, change is bad, or, oh, man, we got to change, or we're in trouble, it's good or bad. Change is a neutral word. It's what happens when you change that causes the good or the bad. And culture is a lot like that. Culture includes good things. Culture includes bad things. Culture includes some things that, frankly, are neutral. And yeah, culture includes some things that are complicated, things that are complex. In our culture, in America, we have embraced our Second Amendment right to bear arms. That's a cultural value that is not present in some other cultures. It's just one example of those. Now, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, the advocates of the Second Amendment will tell you that's a 100% good thing. The opponents of the Second Amendment will tell you that's a 100% bad thing. In reality, it's probably more complicated than that, isn't it? There are points to be made on both ends of the spectrum. There's this middle thing in which we have to figure out this right and what it means and how it affects us and how we live. And so we will find things like that in culture often. And that's one of the things, again, that makes this subject so challenging for Christians as we try to live in the world and accomplish our mission. And so culture is all around us. Again, it is very much like water. And as we live in it, as we're immersed in it, more and more it just becomes normal. It's just the way it is. And it's so much so that in many ways, again, we as Christians begin to not even think about it consciously like we should. Another author has expressed it this way, and again, I think this is as good a way to put it as any. He says, we make our cultures, and then our cultures shape us. Human beings create culture, and then that culture has an impact on anybody who lives in it. And it begins to form us in certain ways. And I think then the question becomes, well, how does that happen? if we're going to understand our role in culture, we need to have some understanding of how our cultures shape us. How does that work? And so, again, we want to be the chocolate chips in the cookie, right? So how do we understand the cookie in which we live, in which we exist? And so very briefly, here is kind of how it works. And you will find other explanations, that's fine. There's literally a million books that have been written on this subject. This works for me. Maybe it'll work for you. Culture, we're shaped by culture because first we absorb the ideas of culture. Ideas are powerful. Culture is built on ideas. A lot of the ideas in culture are unspoken. They just sort of are. For example, in our culture, we have ideas about personal freedom. Our ideas about personal freedom are not the same as you would see if you traveled to a country like Iraq that is operated under the umbrella of Islam. They have different ideas about personal freedom. Our ideas about personal freedom are different than if you travel to a communist nation like North Korea. They have different ideas about personal freedom. And so when you live in a culture, it is run by ideas, and we, as we live, we absorb those ideas. Now, those ideas are spread, and they're spread by what cultural anthropologists would call champions. Champions are the people who originate the idea and try to get them absorbed into the culture. And so in some cultures, it's interesting. In some cultures, the champions, the people that are driving the ideas that cause the culture to be formed and changed, a lot of cultures, those are religious leaders or politicians or scholars or authors. More and more in our culture, the people who are the champions of culture are entertainers and artists and people in the media. And so when we get to for example, when we get to the issues section of this conversation, we'll spend some time talking about some various flavors of human sexuality. There's some things going on in our culture that we need to talk about from a Christian perspective. Again, I mentioned the sexual revolution. The ideas behind the sexual revolution have profoundly influenced our culture, and they have been spread through our culture by a variety of champions. Some of those champions, even though we've been influenced by them, we don't really hardly know who they are. People like Kinsey, who did some early studies on human sexuality. Most people have never heard of him. There are the people who invented the birth control pill. I bet nobody can name those people, but they profoundly influenced our culture. But every one of us, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, and I refuse to put his picture up here, but every one of us knows who Hugh Hefner is, right? Because he was at the core of the sexual revolution through his publication of Playboy magazine and his exaltation of a certain kind of lifestyle. And so he is a champion of that culture and helped to drive that culture through America. And then these champions, here's what they do. They communicate through artifacts. Artifacts are just the stuff we use. Music is an artifact. Tools are an artifact. Books are an artifact. So if you go all the way back to the 15th century and you go back to when they invented the printing press, that changed culture profoundly because suddenly more and more people had an opportunity to learn how to read. There's no bigger change you can make in a culture than to teach people how to read, except maybe the other big change that came about in the printing press, which was that suddenly everybody could have their own copy of the Bible. And so the whole culture changes because the artifacts that could be used to communicate culture suddenly became more diverse. Today, if you are a champion in culture and you are worth your salt in any level, you're going to make some use of all of these glowing screens that we all have, right? We carry them in our pockets, in our backpacks, we have them in our cars, we have them in every room in our house. If you're going to champion ideas, you're going to use those artifacts because that's how we communicate those ideas. And then finally, culture is maintained and it's perpetuated mostly through institutions. And historically, there's sort of a big three. Historically, the big three institutions are the family, the church, and government. Pause and think about that. Are those the things that are shaping our culture today? Probably depends on what you're talking about a little bit. Certainly, we would say that in America, changes in the structure of our family have profoundly reshaped our culture, haven't they? Certainly in America, we would say more and more that religious institutions are in a long, continual decline in terms of the influence that they have in our culture. And what we see in those things is when one institution that influences culture and maintains culture and perpetuates culture, when one declines, something is going to rush in to fill the vacuum. And so again, more and more in our culture, what is filling the vacuum? Media is filling the vacuum. And media today doesn't mean what it used to mean. Media used to be newspapers and magazines and network television. Now media is the internet and all the people who create on the internet. And so our institutions have changed. And so over time, as culture changes, again, what we think of as normal changes along with it. And when something becomes normal, we live by it without perhaps thinking through it. Because it's just the way it is. It's like the air we breathe. When's the last time you really gave a thought to the air you breathe? We just don't think about it. And so, for example, it is now normal in our culture that if you have one moment of freedom where you're not in conversation or you're not doing something, what do? You pick up whatever screen you've got and you start doing something on the screen. That's normal. That's just accepted in most places in our culture. That's the way it is. It is now normal in our culture and probably has been for a while. And you will find this, I think, if you talk to some of our immigrant members, one of the things they find strange about our country. It is normal in our country to live beyond our means. It's normal for us to say, this is how much money I have coming in, and this is how much money I'm going to spend, and I'm going to make up the difference by buying things I don't need and buying them on credit and going into debt. That is normal in our culture, and on we could go. And yet, as C.S. Lewis once said, the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones being argued, but the ones that are assumed. What's normal isn't all dangerous, but some of it is. So what do we do about that as Christians? As Christians, do we recognize what parts of the culture are to be embraced? Because some parts of our culture as Christians we do need to embrace. Do we recognize what those are? Do we recognize what parts in our culture are to be avoided? And here's another big question we have to ask. Are there parts of culture that perhaps need to be confronted? Where Christians need to say, not only are we not going to do this, we're not going to stand for this. Are there some of those as well? Which gets us closer to the heart of all of this, because part of our calling as disciples is to learn discernment, and I think a big part of our discernment is cultural discernment. And so Paul puts it this way. He has this to say in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. He says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. God calls us not to conform, but to be transformed. And so the question then really does become, in this process of being transformed ourselves, will we also have transformational power in our culture? Or to put it another way, can we as Christians shape our culture? And that's the question that we're going to begin to take up next week. Let's stand together and let's sing.
I heard an old story, how the Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about his groaning, of his precious blood's atoning. Then I repented of my sins and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood.
You were reared up and ready to go there, weren't you? Jeff, thank you for that sermon today. We had talked actually about this series some time ago among the elders and preachers, and it's just important because we see things changing around us at a rapid rate. Some of those issues over the coming weeks. A few reminders before we wrap up today. Bible classes, a new Bible class starting in the auditorium today. Bill and his team have finished up the overview of Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. And Jeff will be starting a 4-week class today, a look at the parables. Paul Florio will be continuing in classroom 2 and 3 with I Will, nine traits of the outwardly focused Christian. So that's in classroom 2 and 3. A few reminders too, tonight is a small group night. Some small groups may or may not be meeting because of the holiday, so check with your leader. The Lidditz small group will be meeting at 5 o'clock at our house. Next Saturday is, again, one of our annual events that Janet and her team oversee, Girls for God's Day. Next Saturday, so if you have not signed up to attend that and would like to, make sure you see Janet. And as Jeff reminded you, if you plan to go to the retreat, today is the last day to sign up for the church retreat, which is coming up the June 8th through the 10th. So I think that's all we have for today, and let's close in a word of prayer. Dear God, it is always good when God's people get together. We come from a crazy world when things distract us, and it's good for us to get together and encourage one another. It's good for us to get together and be reminded of your word, to hear teaching from your word. And we thank you, God, for being there to hear our prayers and to hear our concerns and our petitions. And we pray today that as we leave this place, that you would help all of us to remember who we are and what you want us to be, and that we would live lives that would be worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's through him that we offer this prayer. Amen.